break the chains that I let bind me, heal the pain that lives inside me.
Welcome back to Swordbox. Special thanks to David for his music and his ministry, and also I want to thank Sandy for continuing to tirelessly post these videos each day so that you guys can watch them. I guess it's Saturday. We looked at Satan, we looked at his intentions, which are to kill, steal, and destroy, and how he has come after God's creation with craftiness, with deception, in order to turn them away from God. Before we move forward, I want us to look again at the account of Satan in the Garden of Eden so that we may gain a more complete picture of just what the results of Satan's successful temptation of Eve and the fall of man were, because the results have affected every human being born since Adam and Eve. Even though it's difficult for us to imagine, prior to this encounter with the devil, this world was perfect. It was, as God stated, good. And so were Adam and Eve. Had sin not entered, it would have remained so, and Adam and Eve would have never died, either spiritually or physically. Of course, they did die both spiritually and physically. And as we know, Eve was deceived, and she ate of the tree, and she gave also to Adam, who ate knowingly. He wasn't deceived, but he ate the fruit knowing he was disobeying God. Now, when this took place, sin, which is breaking or not keeping God's law, entered the world and entered man, and so entered death. Just as God had warned, it entered the world and it entered man. Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men, because all sin. Sin by its very nature spreads, contaminates, and always leaves its mark. Sin creates a debt to God. We owe, essentially, God for our sin against Him. That entered man as well, a need to be made right with a holy God whose standard is holiness, perfect obedience. This was now broken because man and woman were no longer perfect, but were now sinners. So after they sinned, their eyes were opened, and now they knew good and evil, and became aware of their nakedness. Suddenly what was once pure and innocent and good had become corrupted and shameful, and they covered themselves, and then in shame they hid from God." You know, nothing good comes from choosing to disobey God. Nothing. When God confronted man and the woman and the serpent in the garden after this all happened, they all received consequences. We won't go into all of these, but you know, God also cursed the serpent, and this beast would now slide on its belly. But the verse I wanted us to see is verse 15 in Genesis. Speaking to the serpent, Satan, God said, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." God is speaking about the woman's seed here, who would eventually be Jesus, who would one day come, and speaking about the devil's seed, man born into sin, lost and unbelieving. Satan could only bruise, but Christ would strike a fatal blow to Satan and death at the cross when he would one day pay our sin debt in full. Even in man's darkest hour of rebellion, God has a plan in place to redeem, to save, and to restore, because God is so very good. I want us to see something here that's extremely important. While it seems the devil's just making havoc in heaven and on earth, and it seems like he's having his way with things, everything is by God's purpose and by God's plan, and God knows everything. He already knows everything that was going to happen here in the garden, and He already had a plan for man's redemption. In Ephesians, we see clearly that even though it appears to be all going wrong in Genesis, it's not. Ephesians 1:4, He's speaking to believers. It says, "Just as He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before Him in love." This is before the world was ever even created. Before God even created the world, He knew what would happen, and He already chose us to live in His righteousness and His love. Verse 5 says that He predestined us to adoption. God has predetermined for us to be His, and nothing Satan does or nothing Satan did can ever stop the purposes in the will of God. Verse 11 says, "In Him we also have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will." These verses should encourage us and strengthen us to remind us just who runs the show. God is in control, and I encourage you to take some time to go back and read through Ephesians chapter 1 if you can. God's not caught off guard. He's not playing catch up to Satan. It's all part of His eternal purpose. Even the wicked, rebellious Lucifer, God uses for His own purposes and for His own glory. And we need to remember that. You know, I doubt Adam and Eve or even Satan knew all that God was saying here in Genesis. He was talking about an amazing plan that would unfold many, many years later. But God's plan, nonetheless. God is always in control and always works things according to his plans and his will. Now we saw where Satan wanted to ascend to God's throne. He wanted to set up his own kingdom and be like God. Well, that didn't happen. And so now because of man's sin, Satan has come into the world. He's set up his kingdom on earth. And we see plenty of evidence of this in Scripture. Ephesians 6:12 tells us, "For we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." As I said in the beginning of this series, we're at war, not against people, but against Satan and his demons, like it or not. Now, no man fully understands how the devil and his fallen angels move about, where they can go, how they can get there. But as I see from Scripture, as I've said before, they seem to have access, at least in part, to heaven, and certainly here on earth. One thing is clear. They have set up a very structured army of darkness and have been very effective for a very long time here on earth. If you recall the Old Testament book of Job, Satan was here seen in heaven. This is after the fall of man in the garden, where we know Satan came to the earth, yet we see him again in heaven appearing before God. Job 1:6, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan also came among them, and the Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' So Satan answered and said to the Lord, 'From going to and from the earth, from walking back and forth on it.'" So here we see that Satan, and I would assume other fallen angels, have access to heaven, if only to answer to God. And they also have access to earth, as we've seen in the garden. Satan can't be everywhere at once. He's limited, yet obviously gets around faster than you and I can. He's a spiritual being and not limited to human bodies like we are. And we know what Satan is walking to and fro on the earth for. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Seeking whom he may devour." But I believe Satan and his fallen demons are not just clumsily walking around with no organization, no objectives, no plans, but rather very structured, very organized, and very orchestrated together in their purposes. And he has set up his kingdom of darkness here. Scripture refers to him in several ways to the earth. 2 Corinthians 4:4 is referred to the God of this age. In Ephesians, we saw the references to principalities, which apply to various applications of order, time, place, or rank. Powers, in his case supernatural. Rulers, in Satan's case, he has been the ruler of this world. In many ways. In Revelations 2:13, Jesus is speaking to the church in Pergamos and says this in verse 14, "I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even then in the days of Antiochus, who was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." Remember in Isaiah 14, Satan's desire was to exalt his throne above the stars of God? Well, obviously that's not going to happen, but here in Revelation it would seem he has settled for a throne here on earth for now, even though we know this throne is not going to last. Satan has not stopped his quest to be like God, to be worshipped and served. And we may not like to think about it. It may make us uncomfortable, but when we sin, we are following, we are serving, and we are accomplishing the purposes of Satan. And we're going to pick up here tomorrow and talk about just whose kingdom are you in and how you can know who you're following, whether you're following the kingdom of light or whether you're following the kingdom of darkness. God bless you. Thanks for tuning in to the Swordbox. We'll see you back here